today we're going to be hearing about John's time in the military, and then following the military, how he came home to run his family's tiny grain storage business, and built that into what it became. And last year I read a quote, and I thought about coming up with a new one, but I thought that gosh darn quote was so good, I'm going to use the same one again this year. Jacques Cousteau had said, "When one man, for whatever reason, has the opportunity to lead an extraordinary life, he has no right to keep it to himself." And that's certainly going to be true here today. John has had amazing experiences, and by golly, they really should be shared, because it's a treasure to have someone like this in our community, and I think we all understand and realize this, the importance of it, that how someone from itty-bitty Roseville can go out and accomplish just stunning things in life, and it's something that can inspire the rest of us when we feel down that we may not be able to accomplish something. We can say, yes, we can, because people in our own backyard have been able to accomplish such things. So I'm going to cut to the chase, and ladies and gentlemen, let's introduce John Twomey. Come on up, John.
Well, Sean kind of tends to exaggerate, but I'll forgive him for that. Could I turn that light on? Oh, it doesn't work. But hey, this is a pretty good light right here. Okay, because I'm going to need a little light today. Well, to start with, I better say ladies and gentlemen, of course, the neighbors, and which I've got neighbors here too, and lots of Twomey family members who are here today for me to deliver my story, the rest of the story, as Sean has so aptly called it. And he's always said what I'm going to talk about, so I could skip that. That'll save me a few seconds. But anyway, I'll go ahead then, and I'll start with the story about when I went into the military service during World War II. On the Sunday evening, December 7th of 1941, I was home from college down at Western at Macomb for the weekend, and I heard the news that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. I didn't think a lot about it at the time. I didn't think, well, gosh, I'll be going into the service. But on Monday, all of the students were called into the big auditorium down at Western to listen to President Roosevelt's radio address about declaring war on Japan. And just a day or two later, however many days it was, then he also then declared war on Germany, and we were called back in to hear the president for a second time. Shortly thereafter, I tried to volunteer for flight training. I always thought it'd be a great thing to be able to fly an airplane, and to this day I still don't know how to fly one. But in the fall of 1942, when I got back to college that fall, why the Dean of Men called all of the men into his office and explained to each one of them how if you would volunteer for the Army Reserve, the government would allow you to stay in college and finish your school year out. So I did that, and then in June of 1943, I was then inducted into the military service at Camp Grant, which is up near Chicago. Now, hey, I did that pretty good. I got the page turned without this thing on my finger. I forgot I had it on here. I got this from Janine O'Daniels today so that I could be able to, I got worried about, and of course I asked Sarah, I said, Sarah, I'm a little worried about turning these pages. Have you got one of those things to put on your finger? She said, well, Dad, just lick your finger. And I said, well, I don't like to do that. And so anyway, she said, well, I'll check around and see if I can find you one of those things. And luckily, Janine found it, and she called it, what was it? Yeah, it's a fickle finger. That's, yeah. So you learn something new every day. Well, when during the induction at Camp Grant, I went in to do my physical, and the doctor started listening to my heart, and he said that he thought I had a heart murmur. Or matter of fact, he didn't think, he heard it. And I knew I had one. I'd always had one as a boy. But I wasn't worried about it because our home doctor said, it's okay, you could go out and run track or whatever you want to do. It won't hurt you any. But I was fearful of being 4F and sent home because that was a curse back in those days. And so I was worried about it. I told the doctor, I said, well, you know, I've been running for the last 4 years, distance running. And he looked at me and said, well, if you can do that, there's nothing wrong with you. And of course, he stamped my papers, and I was in the Army. And I was happy about that. There was a track meet in nearby Chicago, and I thought, well, I could go in there and run one more race. So I went to see the Special Services officer and explained what I wanted to do. But he said, well, we can't let anyone leave the base right now. And he said, I suppose he wanted to do me a favor. He said, well, what would you like to be in the Army? I told him about the Air Corps and my efforts to do that. So he reached for the phone, called the classification office, and pretty quick he turned to me and said, son, you're in the Army Air Corps. So I got my wish. So that was a little turn in my life. I was able to stay in the service. I was able to go to the Army Air Corps, something I wanted to do. And some of you here today have heard the poem, The Road Not Taken, by Robert Frost. Google research says that it's the most popular poem during the past 35 years, without any question, the most popular poem in this modern time. And it has always been one of my favorite poems. It has only 20 lines. The last three read, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Most all of us here today have come to those forks in the road and made choices on which way to proceed, and have altered our lives forever. After 14 months of training in the United States and Texas, South Dakota, Arizona, Nevada, and California, we were allowed our first and only time to visit our home for 5 days. Traveling by train, I lost 2 days by floods in Nebraska, so I only had 3 days at home in my 2.5 to 2.5 years of military service. At Hamilton Field in California, north of San Francisco, our crew was assigned a new B-24 bomber. In the Army during World War II, most of us were just a number. Crews were listed in alphabetical order, and our pilot named Lippet, when the L's came up, that day they were leaving for India. We flew across the U.S. to Maine, then to Labrador, Newfoundland, the Azore Islands, Morocco in North Africa, and Tunis, and Egypt across North Africa, and into Iran, and finally to an air base north of Calcutta. A big trip for yours truly, who had never traveled beyond the Midwest before. Now, yours truly arrives at his first residence. And right away, I go out the next morning to kind of check on the traffic. And along came an elephant. So I decided, I must be in some foreign country. It's India. That's right. I remembered then. So, and now following the elephant here, of course, I've got several slides of our crew. They used to love to paint pictures and art on the sides of the plane. So that's the nose gunner and myself standing by this picture on the front of a B-24. And then I'm looking out to see if there's how the monsoons are doing that day, because you have lots of rain in India. It rains about every day. Then this is another thing we always used to do, and I never know why we did it, but we pushed the props through before the pilot would try to fire up the engines. And then this is the engineer on our crew. Each one of we enlisted men had a job to do. This was our engineer from Ohio, Joe, and I don't know if he's checking the gas or what he's doing, but you do have to be careful that your plane's working good, because you're always taking off with a heavy load, landing with a heavy load, and that's the critical moments for you to make sure that everything's okay. I was the radio operator on the plane, and I sat behind the pilot and co-pilot, but I couldn't really see them because I had all of this radio stuff in front of me. So I would usually get up and stand between the two pilots when we'd take off, just to make sure they were going to make it. And then so we have these different positions on the plane. This is the nose gunner. You can see a gun sticking out there. And then we have the the turret underneath. You have thing underneath, which they call the belly, and then you have one on the top, which I don't have a picture of that. But then also we also cover the tail of the plane. No, wait, first we do the waist. And the engineer and I, once we were on a mission and we were over enemy territory, you couldn't use the radio any longer. And of course the planes were flying good by that time, so the engineer and I, we were not needed. So our job was to go back into the waist of the plane, in the middle of the plane, just a big empty hole back there. And on each side there was a window where you have a 50 caliber machine gun. We didn't really have to use these machine guns because by the time we were flying missions, the Japanese didn't really have enough aircraft, or they couldn't afford to lose what they had. So all they would do was shoot at us from the ground. So we really, you might say, hardly used those at all, but we had them. And what they did do, they scared the enemy away, because if we hadn't had those guns, they'd have been right up there to get us. So this is to completes the round through the plane, is a guy in the tail of the plane who survived the war, but he was killed right after he got home in an accident where he was running a bulldozer and a big tree fell over on top and killed him. So that was the poor end of poor Donald from New York. So he never made any of our reunions. And that kind of completes the pictures there of the crew members, I think. And so then we started going on these missions. And of course what we did, we flew a lot over Burma and Thailand, and we would hit a lot of bridges, and we would hit the rail terminals in Rangoon, which is a big city. And there was quite a bit of flak in Rangoon, of course. And as you'd go through on different waves, you'd have a group of planes ahead of us, some behind us, of course. We were all going over. So you'd always see how they were trying to hit the people ahead of you. And the Japanese were not near the shots that the Germans were. So, you know, it was even getting shot at wasn't real bad. You had to keep your fingers crossed. And then this is a special mission we went on, which was called, this is the bridge over the River Kwai, which it was made into a movie. And this is one of the bridges that we bombed. It was only, a short distance out of Bangkok. But anyway, that was kind of a famous bridge to build. And I didn't realize that until I was reading the Chicago Tribune in the travel section many years later, and I saw the name of the town, Kanchanaburi, and I thought, oh gosh, that's where we bombed. As I read more of it, then I realized it was a bridge over the River Kwai. We had no idea what we were bombing at the time. So I want to tell you a little bit about India, Calcutta. I went down there for a couple of days to just look around. And of course, one of the big things you see a lot of are the sacred cows. And they're very careful not to do anything to hurt the cows. The cows can walk right into the shops or anything they want to do. But if you're a pedestrian, the cab driver is liable to run over you. But they would never run over a cow. And then there's lots of disease and poverty. Well, first thing you see, I wasn't familiar with people being homeless either. You know, back in those days, I didn't know what a homeless person was. But over there, you could quite early on see how people just laying everywhere in the streets, maybe no place to live. And then there was all kind of people deformed by disease. And also, this is a thing I saw a fair amount of. This is called elephantiasis, to where your leg becomes a big leg like this that you just have to drag it around with you as you crawl around on the street, and that's a pitiful scene to see. So I had really had my eyes opened up when I went to Calcutta to see what a great country we lived in and how bad it was in a country like India. And then, of course, when these poor Indians died, they only lived to an age of about 20 or so on the average. This is what's called the burning ghats. So we went in to see this and see where they were burning the bodies. They put them on a pile of logs like this. You can see the legs hanging out. And so we stood there and watched them burning the bodies. And I don't know if they're doing, yeah. And then for a little change of pace, we did get to go on a little trip one time. So I went to a nice, more peaceful place. It was called Shillong, where it rains from 600 to 900 inches a year. And it's supposed to be the wettest place in the world. And so that was kind of a relief to get to go and see something like that. This was up in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. And then the first thing you know, we're in China just in time for Christmas. And so that's how I spent Christmas in China, living in a tent. And you could see our water system up behind the barrels to get water pressure so we could take a shower. And then also you'll see these two women that are walking down here. They come onto the base just looking for tin cans or beer bottles or anything that they could find, because all those kind of things have a great value over there in a poverty, because China was very poverty-stricken at that time too. And you could see with the look of the land that we were in desert country at about 6,000 feet elevation, and that's where we were flying out of on our missions in China. What we did when we were in China, we were flying gasoline to Claire Chennault. He was a general. They called the Flying Tigers. So we flew gasoline mostly at night, 100 octane fuel. They'd taken our plane where we used to carry the bombs. Now they had rubber tanks in there, and we could carry about 2,000 gallons of gas. And if we burnt too much gas on the way there, we'd have to take 500 or 1,000 gallons of it and put back in the plane to get back home. But anyway, we were getting gas into the Flying Tigers to keep them flying, because these airfields in southeast China, they were surrounded by the Japanese, but the Allies still held the airfields. So now, after we're heading back, we're setting on our luggage, and you see the tents over on the other side. Those are the tents we lived in, and we're heading back to India. And I don't know what I was going to say about that now, but well, I know why, because you see, we lost the airfields. They fell back into the whole area, then airfields and all. The Japanese took the entire area over, so there's no longer need for our service. So then we head back to India, to a state way up the northeast corner of India called Assam. There we started flying gasoline again, but this time we were right located next to the Mount Everest and the mountains of northern Burma, and northern Burma was called the Hump. So then our next job was to fly over this hump and fly into China with the gasoline, just into a peaceful area, of course. But the only thing we had to do, we had to fly over Burma, which was still held by the Japanese. So you want to make sure that you stayed up in the air. It was very difficult flying because you had to fly on instruments. You couldn't see where you were going. And you had hope that the instruments were working properly. And you had to hang onto your seats real tight, because seat belts that hadn't been invented then, or at least to my knowledge they hadn't. And those air drafts would just suck you up out of your seat and flop you back into it. And it was quite a job just to hang on as you were flying through that turbulent air. So anyway, after flying this bunch of gasoline, and just before the war ended with Germany, I had all of my time in. I had in 450 what they call combat hours, for which I received the Distinguished Flying Cross. I was ready to head home just before Japan surrendered. And I'd had my moments when I wondered if this day would come, and now it was a reality. So the next thing and also, this is the first picture there was just a propaganda that we dropped when we'd fly over Burma, and it had a little salt packet stapled to it, because salt was a valuable thing for those people to get. And this was propaganda to try to win them over. And then the next slide was when President Roosevelt died. We dropped leaflets again to let those people know that President Roosevelt had died, but it probably says that don't worry, your sea be free of the Japanese. And so that was the propaganda. And then the next picture, I'm on a Liberty ship sailing for home. And it took me 30 days to get home to New York. And of course, I'd never seen New York before, so I saw it from the water coming in to America from the east for the first time in my life. And I saw the Statue of Liberty. The Red Cross girls were all there with little packets of milk for us. I didn't really like milk, I never did, but I drank it because it's better than what I'd had in India. But then just before I headed home, I got this 3-page letter from my father, and I wanted to comment on that. Oh, yeah. Hey, yeah, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, pardon me. So anyway, after I got to New York, I passed through Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and Fort Sheridan in Chicago. I boarded the train for Monmouth. Yes, trains stopped back in Monmouth in those days. I wanted to surprise my parents, so I was able to hitch a ride from someone at the train station and be dropped off at the country road leading to the farm home. And I was able to surprise my parents when I walked in that day. Walking the last half mile, excited about seeing my parents, a walk that my sister and I had made many times as children to get the mail, as we always had to walk a half a mile to get our mail. I was not running, but just walking and meditating and thinking about getting home. And I would like to now to end this part of my talk about the military by telling you a few excerpts from the letter that my dad wrote to me, his take on the war's end. So as follows. 2 days, of course, had been set aside in the U.S. for the celebrating the end of the war. My dad said he did not feel like celebrating. He wanted to be in the fields working and meditating. He thought how horrible the war had been and how he wished our great President Roosevelt could have lived to see the end. He said he had worked as hard on the farm as any time in his life, because I wasn't there to help him. He had bought as many war bonds as he could afford. How happy he was that it was over, and how proud he was that his son was in there doing his part. And that completes the first part of my message. So now we'll move on to Twomey Company. Twomey Company had a 66-year history, and it's of course a little hard to condense it into 30 minutes, but I will try. I arrived home in time to help my father receive the first soybeans into his newly acquired grain elevator in Smithshire. In 1945, corn was still being harvested as ear corn and dried by Mother Nature in slatted granaries on the farm and delivered to elevators when they sold it. So the fall harvest at the elevator was mostly soybeans. And to tell you a little bit more about this first little elevator, it only held about the equivalent of one large barge of grain, was the size of the elevator. And without us even having any dreams of growing as much as we did, we finally grew to where our capacity was approximately 900 barges. So the first thing that I experienced after kind of getting into the business, my dad, about a decade passed, and then our grain elevator was completely destroyed by fire, and the office at that time had been attached to the elevator, so we lost the office and the elevator and everything. And of course, we had all the farmers' records in fire files, and B.I. Goranson from Norris Office Equipment was right down there to tell us. He said, "Now don't open those files when you get them uncovered, because everything will ignite if you open them up. Because when those things, heat causes them to swell and shut the air out. So you need to wait for those files to cool." So we left the files lay for 2 or 3 days before we opened them. And then when we did, all of the farmers' records were there. So everybody knew exactly all the records were there, everything we needed. So that we retained probably the one thing that was the most important of all, were the fire files. Now, what happened then, in the next thing we have here is a flat storage. I talked to my dad. I said, "Well, Dad, I think we ought to get into the grain storage business for the government." So we built this long building here. It looks big there, but it was only 40 feet wide by 140 feet long and held about a little over a barge of grain. So we entered into that in 1953. And then you'll see way down in the right-hand corner, where it's kind of dark, that's where we were clearing the land and getting ready to rebuild a new elevator in that area. And we needed a little extra room, so we took that corn crib that you see right there, and with bins around it, and we moved it over into that other dark area where there were some shabby old buildings, and relocated that so we would have more room to build a larger grain elevator. And this is a new elevator. It was a slip form where you just keep inching the thing up every day, and you never stop pouring concrete. We worked for about 40 days, 24 hours a day, and we had about 50 men. It was my job to hire all of the people and kind of manage the workforce. So, and we had all kind of farmers volunteer to help us. Of course, they got paid for it, but they were all right there to help us, which this way we didn't have to rely upon bringing a union in, which the union thought we needed them, but we convinced them that we didn't. And I guess being in a small company like a town like Smithshire, they were willing to just forget about us. So these farmers helped us, and we inched this thing up every hour, day and night for 40 days. And then at the very top, there's a head house, and then you'll see a forming around that. That's the last of the scaffolding. The other scaffolding around the bigger part had already been torn down earlier, but this is how we could walk around the outside and finish the concrete as well as the inside. And then when you get all done, of course, you tear all of that off and you have your concrete elevator. Then I have a picture of my dad here. My dad, this was 1956, and he was only to live for another 5 years. And Dr. Roller said 10 years later, if he had still been alive, we could have saved him. But, medical science had advanced, and the problems that he had were not available. So my dad passed on at 61 at the only age of 62 years of age. But this big thing on the wall there is just a thing where we could monitor the grain in the tanks, so we would know in all of the 16 bins in our elevator, we would know about every 10 feet what the temperature was. And temperature is such an important thing, because if your corn heats up or soybeans heat up, they're going to spoil, and you're going to have tremendous cost of penalty for bad grain. So then also I have this. That was my dad, and then the next generation I have my nephew Joe, and then my son Craig, and then my nephew John, and then myself, and then my brother Vic. We were the next generation, the two generations then that were to finish out the time of Twomey Company. And then we have my mom here. This was taken from an earlier article, a magazine article that was put out by the Prudential Insurance Company. And that's my mom on the right, my sister Norma in the middle, and my deceased sister Mary Jane on the left. Some of you may remember Mary Jane. And I'll just take a moment to tell you that in this article they had, Prudential was a lot of it was about the success of the Twomey Company and also the Twomey Farms. But when my dad was building the elevator back in 1956, he needed to borrow some money, so he went to Prudential Insurance Company and wanted to know that we had money borrowed on the farmland, if they would loan us the money that we needed to finish up the construction of the grain elevator. They said, well, we don't loan on just strictly farmland. So my dad went to John Hancock, which is another insurance company, and they readily agreed that they would loan us the money, but they would want the Prudential loans transferred to them. My dad said, well, I better check with Prudential first. He went back and told Prudential what John Hancock would do for him. And they said, if John Hancock can do it, so can we. And with that, in this book it tells, in this article, that this was the first ever grain elevator loan in the history of Prudential Insurance Company. So that's a little story about my dad, how he was able to convince them to loan him the money. In the mid-1950s, I want to tell you about the revolution of the corn combine, of which you see a lot of them today. Everything's the corn combine, and the revolution has really blossomed and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Pardon me. It started whereby the corn was removed from the cob as it passed through the combine. This allowed for harvesting at higher moisture and using grain dryers to dry the corn down to about 14% moisture, a safe level for storage of shell corn. Twomey Company was at the forefront by providing commercial drying and storage from the beginning for shell corn coming from corn combines. We needed to continually expand this service to meet a rapidly growing demand from farmers. By 1965, we built our second grain facility, and finding it difficult to deliver grain to grain processors and to barge companies, terminals, we decided we needed our own barge loading facility on the Mississippi River just west of Gladstone, and it would be just for our own customers, no one else. Our business was altered drastically at this point, and the level of risk was unknown. We are now dealing with export and barge companies, and the volume increasing as we expanded to Yorkwood and Media, and with farmers now almost exclusively shelling their corn in the fields and yields increasing almost every year. By 1972, we were loading barges and had to sell at a minimum a barge load, which meant that was from 50 to 60,000 bushels of grain we had to sell. Well, when you're buying grain in small lots, if you buy 7,000, and we needed to hedge it, and we need to do our marketing by using the Board of Trade, and these contracts are every 5,000 bushels. So if you buy 7,000 bushels, are you going to sell 5 and gamble on 2, or are you going to sell 10 and be oversold 3,000? And of course, you can multiply that, because sometimes we get to work at a lot bigger numbers. But in other words, you can't protect yourself completely in your marketing. There's always a degree of risk. And at this point, of course, the business gets much more complicated. Because another thing that happened, barge freight was totally unregulated. And they always have what's 100% of tariff, which is about 15 cents a bushel on corn. But if they're desperate for business, they might sell you some corn, some barge freight at half price, which would be 7.5 cents, to get it to New Orleans. Or they might say, we want 200%, which would be 30 cents. And we never know which way this market's going to go. And we always, when you're loading barges, the shipper has to provide the freight. So not only are you working with the futures market, which is fluctuating, but you're trying to get the right number of bushels sold, but you also have the problem of the barge freight. So do you buy barge freight ahead of time in anticipation it's going to get higher, or do you wait till you're ready to load the barge and take your chance? See, you just don't know. So there's so much risk, so much to do like this. And of course, in 1972, the first year we loaded on the river, we didn't even have a grain elevator there. So we just built a wall out of sheet piling and put rock in behind us so we'd have a way to drive out to this wall. And then we backed up a tractor auger on a farm oil tractor, and we would back our trucks up to that, dump trucks, and we loaded 2 million bushels that summer over that wall into barges. No elevator at all, of course. And so by 1973, we had put in a pit and a thing that would a little building like that. You can see it's not a very good picture, but it takes the loading device up into the airways, and then you'll see a spout on the end. And the people who are loading the barges, they're setting up in the top of this place, so they're able to look right down into the barge and see exactly what they're doing. And also, by keeping that tower high, we ended up we were the only ones in the end that could load on the mid-Mississippi when the water got really high, because our thing was higher in the air, and we could get the barges under it and get the spout into it to get started. So we were able to load barges on the river until they closed the river due to high water. As long as the river was open, no matter how high the water, we could load barges. And this was all our own design, and there was a guy who works for the company I'm going to introduce you to here later that figured that out, probably. We all went and looked at stuff, but he was always the guy who had the right answers to how to do things. Another thing that happened in 1972 was a thing called the Great Grain Robbery. That's where the Russians came in that spring, and we were going to have a big crop in the U.S. that fall, but in Russia, they were having one of their worst nightmares on their crops, and they were going to have hardly any production. The Russians kept everything secret. They never allowed anybody to come into their country to see their crops, and we didn't have satellites back in those days to check things. So they came to the United States. They went to several export facilities and bought up all the corn and soybeans and wheat and things that they would need to run their country and to feed their people. When the people in the United States finds this out, what's happened, then everything skyrocketed. Soybeans went from $3, which had been a normal price, when corn was $1, beans maybe $3. Why, soybeans went to $12 in 1 year, 4 times over. Well, so through all this experience, yours truly, I stumbled through this maze of marketing as the futures went from what was called a carry to an inverted market. Well, I'll try to explain that a little bit, but we would not be able to load over the wall until July of that year was when we got started. So naturally, being in July, we had hedged our grain, our corn, in the July future, which was a normal thing that you would do. This meant that instead of July corn futures being higher than, say, May futures were zooming past the July futures, and our hedges were in the wrong month. To make a long story short, yours truly found his way out and realized there was a need for a trained grain and barge hedger. By 1974, we brought Jim Kiesler aboard, and he was the head of our grain merchandising for the next 40 years until we sold the business. Now, marketing is a very complex and hard to explain in a few words. And I don't know, you're probably at all lost what I'm talking about on these futures and so forth, or some of you may be, but I won't try to figure that out right now today. But the next thing that happened now, once we have the river place, it did open the door for us for a lot of new things. So we thought we'd try our hand in the waxy corn, which is, it looks like any corn. You can't tell the difference, but if you go into a grocery store in the United States, in Western Europe or Japan, in the industrialized world, all of the cornstarch that goes into canned products is waxy corn, not regular corn, but waxy corn, because the molecules in the cornstarch are different and makes the waxy corns so that everything congeals and stays together and it's like homogenized milk. The cream doesn't rise to the top. Everything stays together, and you don't open a can of pie mix and find a layer of water in the top of the can. Everything stays mixed together, and that's why the waxy corn is so important to the food industry. And that's why we got into this, and it was a good business. We got to shipping waxy corn to Japan and to Europe. And we were actually directly selling it to these buyers in the foreign countries. So we would make trips to visit them. They would come to see us. So it was another exciting new take in the grain business that we had never been in before. And then also the beets and soybeans on the right is a soybean that made very good tofu in Japan. And at our biggest year ever in about the mid-1970s to the latter part of the 1970s, one year we did ship almost 1 million bushel of soybeans to Japan for tofu. And that was an interesting venture for. But finally, when the big companies find out what you're doing, then they want to take over. And that's kind of what happened. As the big companies got into it, we just needed to step aside and let them have it. So we moved on from this, but this was an interesting thing to be in. And then we used to get, my wife Mary would come down. She'd helped weigh trucks all through the harvest for about a decade. And here she has Martha Whiteman and Peg Efall with her, and she's explaining to them how you take these kernels of corn and treat them with a liquid, and if the kernels turn dark, they're just regular corn. So you can't, for the waxy corn, it had to be 95% pure. You could not have more than 5 kernels out of 100 that would turn dark. Otherwise, the corn would have to be rejected by you, and also, if you didn't do it, your buyer would reject your shipments. So this is very important. We had to check every load of corn that came in for the purity of the waxy. By the summer of 1978, huge surpluses of corn, plus the prospect for a huge harvest, caused the corn market to drop to about $1 per bushel. With most of the 1977 crop still in storage, most farmers and commercial warehouses like ours had a big problem to solve. When we realized the problem, harvest was only 2 months away. We decided to build a warehouse 240 feet wide instead of 120, by 500 feet, that'd be twice as much, and put the corn into the warehouse with a portable conveyor. Started building in August, and we were filling in October as they were putting the roof on. This got us through 1978. Just all we were doing at that time was just striving for last-minute storage space. And that's all we were doing in the beginning, to fill a need. It was just like a roof over a pile of grain is what the big building was. Now, the U.S. had become the world's residual supplier of corn, which meant all the excess corn that had to be carried over was in the United States. The world surplus was mostly in the U.S. In order to save farmers from financial disaster, the government came up with a grain reserve program so that the farmer could be paid 26.5 cents to store the grain. As long as there was a major surplus, the government would continue to pay the 26.5 cents and did so for about a decade. Since our annual charge was less than 20 cents, the farmer could pocket 6.5 cents each year, and we had to provide all the costs of storage and preserve the quality if they stored with us. The greatest opportunity of our lifetime was knocking at our door. We needed three things: the cheapest cost possible to build storage, financing with low interest rates, and most important of all, to be able to preserve the quality for long-term storage, because that's what we were getting into, was long-term. So the quality was the most important of all those things. So I want to go now to here's the 1953 building again. When we put that grain in there in 1953, we put it in flat in there. We get in and stir it several times a year and walk over the top. We treat it with chemicals. We do everything we could to preserve the quality of that corn. We took that same corn out 9 years later and made grain with it, with the same corn. We had stored that corn for 9 years and had preserved it. So that taught me a lesson that here's the little building down in the corner here. That's the way it was, only 40 feet wide. And way over in the other corner, I have one example. All those other buildings down there, the buildings plus the tank, you shows the black stuff in the middle. That's to represent the foreign material that collects when you fill something in one place or when you fill it just down the middle. Those fines all collect in that area, and then you can't pull air through there, and corn needs air to stay healthy. It has to breathe that air, and when you stop that air from coming through, that corn starts to spoil, and then it's like a bad apple in a barrel. It spreads even on out to your good corn, and there could be cases where maybe you would lose half of your corn could end up being damaged, and you would have tremendous discounts. One thing the farmer never understood, I don't think with us, was the fact that you couldn't sell corn to exporters unless it was 7% or less. So if somebody brings in 25% 25% damaged grain, in a sense you couldn't take it because you couldn't market that. The only way you could market that grain with the 25% damage in it, you had to string that in with maybe 5 or 6 times that much of good corn in blending in order to work that off. Otherwise, you could never even buy from the farmer that damaged grain. So even though the farmer didn't like the idea of being discounted, and we tried to be as lenient as we could, but we still need to be paid for our blending and all the work we had to do. So it's just, like I say, it's something that I think most of our farmers, or a lot of them, did not understand. They thought, well, they're blending that grain, and whatever discount we've paid, they're sticking that all in their pocket. But what we were we had to discount, and if you didn't have a discount like that, and other elevators did, all the bad grain would come to you. So, we had to do it the way we had to do it in order to keep the whole marketing scheme working. So anyway, getting back to the story, you'll see the big building up here. Instead of being 40 feet wide, we went 240, which would be 6 times as wide. We went 600 feet long instead of a little over 100, which is 5 times as long. So when all those moves allowed us to cut the cost per bushel in half, approximately half, or cut it way down. So see, that was part of our scheme. We had to get the cost down. So I think we can move on from this slide here, and This shows you another example. This is just an outdoor pile, but it shows you how we would pile the grain straight across. And that way you're scattering the foreign material all the way across your building. This, you move back and go back the other way. You just keep doing that. And eventually, all that foreign material is scattered throughout the whole top of the building, not just in the middle. And this is a good example here. This is a box of mini wheats. And we've all experienced this when you get on the bottom of the box and you got all that foreign material. That's still mini wheats, just like that ground up corn and soybeans and things. It's all settled where the conveyor is running. It's still called, it doesn't make a difference if it's weed seed or ground up corn or mini wheats. That's foreign material, and it stops the flow of air. So this was our whole secret, and the thing that we had to do the best job of was to control the quality. Or otherwise, we would be bankrupt in pretty short order. When we built the buildings 240 feet wide, this is 120 feet was as wide as long a distance as you could normally pull air through a tube efficiently and do a good job of aerating grain was 120 feet. So this allowed us to go 240 feet wide by putting pipes going from the center with a cap on them, so where they were capped, and one 120 feet would go this way and the other 120 feet would go the other way. That covered the 240-foot width of the building. So this gave us the most we could do as far as going wide was 240 feet if we wanted to do a good job of aerating. So a lot of those things dictated how we were to develop that. But by the time this government grain reserve program had ended, we had built 15 warehouses. Now you'll see the big arrow on the right, and we called it double wide, double flat, is what they call it. As a matter of fact, that's what a magazine article called it. That was in a grain journal magazine. They call it the double wide, double flat storage warehouse. And the one up in the corner was the very first one we built. So we built 14 of them across here, 4 of them being on the other side of the road and 10 on this side. We finally decided we wanted to go big just one time in our life, so we built one warehouse 1,100 feet long, which 1,100, that was almost a quarter of a mile in length. It held just a little over 5 million bushels. So probably wasn't the greatest idea in the world, but it was actually a little cheaper because we only needed 2 ends instead of 4. If you have 2 buildings, you have 2 ends, and you have to slope the grain down the end, you lose storage, and you have to have extra ends. This way, we could get a little bit more for your money. And then when you get to that last building, which is number 14, then the ground started going off a little bit, so we had run out of land on the sand bluff. And I'm ready for the next slide now, though. But now, this is that big 1,100 footer that you're looking at, and you can see how that's nothing but sand, and they're building on the backside. And what we would do, we would go in with a road patrol, which Kisslers would know all about that, and they put a laser on the blade of the machine, and we'd run that all around there until we had that whole 240 feet by 1,100 feet all perfectly level. And then we just pour concrete on the sand, so we didn't have to put in rock fill, we didn't have to haul away the soft dirt and get rid of that or anything. We were able to build right on the sand, which is all part of our way to cut the cost of the buildings. And so then we move on, and we still think we need a little bit more storage yet. The next site is one where we built a 7-foot, 100-foot long one at Media, Illinois, because for 2 things, we didn't have any more sand land anyway, plus the fact it's always a big problem we were having to haul grain from all these inland facilities to Gladstone in order to take some pressure off there. If we could put a big warehouse right by Media, and that Media is right on the way to the river from Smithshire, we could take a lot of our surplus grain from Smithshire and Media and take it right to Media and put it there, and then later on, when we weren't so busy and the harvest was over, we could eventually move it on to Gladstone and to the river. So all these things were planned to help minimize the effort when you're under the gun. The one other thing I said we have to solve is our finances. Always growing, always in need of financing. Naturally, you would be. 1982 was our biggest year to build double flat storage with 7 warehouses in 1 year. To get an interest rate of 68% of prime, which would be about two-thirds of prime, on industrial revenue bonds, we ended up with the French bank, Crédit Agricole, who furnished us with a letter of credit, which guaranteed the bond buyer's payment if our company was in default. This bank became our major lender for the next 20 years, at which time we had become Crédit Agricole's oldest client in the United States. Over time, we did change to different banks, and for many different reasons. I was going to mention one other thing here too. Just like with Jim Kiesler in the marketing, the accounting, I took care of the accounting for about the first 30 years of our business, along with other things. And of course, it was a very difficult thing to do, and it's something you could put off while you're getting the work that has to be done right now. So I came up with a system which I called undisturbed items. The auditors had never heard of this before, but they liked the idea. What I did, I took all the items in our trial balance that didn't change during the year, or things which would only change once or twice a year, and I set that all out to the side, so I only had to try to really balance things where there was a lot of activity. But I got rid of a lot of things, which shortened up the trial balance by quite a bit. So then this way, when the auditors would come at the end of the year, they'd say, well, we're ready for the undisturbed items. Then I'd give them this list of the things that hadn't changed and the things that had changed very little, and then they plugged that all in, and all that. So I had the rest of it balanced out, so then everything would come out okay. And of course, they had never experienced this before, and I doubt if they ever experienced it since, but they did laugh and said it works. So then about that time, as the business was getting bigger, first we hired Mary Lou Delahunt, who was a little younger than me when I was in the service, and she was a high school girl. She had sent me a gift like the high school girls would send to the troops overseas. So I knew this girl well, but she worked for several years, part-time, or like half days. And then I was thinking, we need somebody here, of course, all day. And of course, maybe Mary Lou would have stayed on, but I want somebody young, too, that will be here long after I walk out the door. I want to get ready for this ahead of time. And one day, a guy by the name of Richard Udine walked in from Monmouth. He didn't even hardly know we existed down there, but somebody had suggested to him that maybe you could get a job at Twomey Company, because what had happened, he had been with the dog food plant and the packing plant, and they had all moved out of town at that time, and he didn't want to leave Monmouth. So he was hoping he could get something here. And of course, we snapped him right up. And he was with the company for the rest of the duration of our business, which was about 30 years. So I felt good about that. Now I'm ready for the Prudential here, which is just, they had a big article in here, which I told you a little bit about my dad's experience. And I got some other pictures out there that helps me in my thing here. One is the loadout conveyor here. This was the very first conveyor that we built to just take grain out of buildings. We built that way back in the 1960s maybe, or something like that. It's just a little 2-foot belt, and we would go into these flat warehouses and take the grain out and put it onto trucks. And that's a bunch of our family standing around that. So anyway, here's the guy, though, the genius, one of the greatest guys that ever worked with me in the business, was a guy by the name of Ralph Layferry, young guy with a high school education and the mind of somebody who had a degree in engineering, and he was a genius. I think he could figure things out maybe better than those people that had the degrees even. And he died at a young age of only 54, but he was with us for 20-some years and was highly responsible for developing equipment and stuff for us to give this high-speed elevation into and out of our warehouses. And that was very critical to us. No matter how big the warehouses were or anything else, if you couldn't get the grain in and out of there fast enough, nothing would work. So, and this is the guy that engineered all of that. And as he would build these conveyors, he kept making them every year a little bigger and better. And by the time we got to the end of the road, we had really great equipment. We probably built, I'll go ahead and tell you more. And now, this is just a sample of a little thing that he did that was not anything big, maybe in a way, but it was just what's called a portable leg. There were just a few companies in the United States that made portable legs. And of course, they had the drive at the bottom. Down at the bottom is the thing that made the belt go. Well, with all the weight of grain in the buckets full of grain on that belt, the belt pretty quick would stretch to the bottom to where it was loose. And that belt would be slipping on the pulley. And you'd have a problem. Well, the minute Ralph saw this and the way they were building them, well, Ralph said, I took him with me that day to look at it. He said, "What, you want to know what I think?" And I said, "That's why I brought you." And he said, we could build one, he said, that's better than that for a lot less money. I said, "Ralph, let's get in the car and go home." So we just went into the office and said, "Well, we're not interested." And we went home, and Ralph developed these machines, and we built several of them, and they worked great. And it's probably the only time anybody ever built a portable elevator leg with the drive on top. The way Ralph did it, he put a big box on the bottom and filled it full of concrete. So it was heavier on the bottom. And then the drive being on the top, the motors and all that stuff it took to run it was not an obstacle at all, because he made it heavier in the bottom just with concrete. So that's just part of his genius. And this is just a little shot. This is a 90-foot conveyor here. And here's another shot of it. Those things ran about 90 to 95 feet. This is where we're piling corn outdoors. And we're just starting a pile here, and then we're moving on. The pile's getting bigger all the time, but all those big long conveyors, Ralph engineered all of that. We built all of those in our welding shop in that little 1953 building that was our first grain storage enterprise. Then after we got building all the big buildings, it became antique, and it became the building for us to build our machinery in. And these piles got bigger and bigger, of course. In 1985, we had over 5 million bushels of grain stored outside because we didn't have warehouses built fast. We couldn't build warehouses any faster than we were going. So we had all of this 5 million, which really what was happening was we were already set to build 2 more buildings without even looking for grain. We already had it. It was on the ground. And so then we would cover these piles up with plastic, and you'll see the little black pipe going up there. That was to let air into the grain underneath the tarp. As we covered, you look down there, you'll see those ribs, and as we put the pipes in and covered it over, and then down in the corner, we'd suck the air out the bottom, and that's how we were able to aerate a pile of grain that was completely sealed on top by letting the air in on the sides. And then this is what happens when winter comes, of course, and that's the finished product. Then you're all set no matter whether it snows or rains or what happens. You've got all this grain kind of halfway secured and ready to go into the next warehouse that you build. So it's nice to have the product to put in it before you even make your investment of building. And that's why I didn't want to stop building, because the opportunity was still there. I was also going to tell you that back when we were talking about the corn outdoors, I stopped and visited with some of the people from CGB here in Monmouth the other day, and I said, "Do you mind telling me how much grain you got out here? Because I could give people here an idea what 5 million bushels would be like." A lot of you have seen what they've been piling out here, which they have about 1 2/3 million bushels. We had 3 times that much piled out back in 1985. Gives you a little concept for the 5 million versus what you see out there. He said it's okay for me to tell you about that. Now, the next thing that came along was another magazine, was the Grain Journal, a publication for the grain trade, and they have this elevator here for their cover. This is what we built in Gladstone in 1986, because we did it backwards. We built the storage first, and then the grain receiving at the end, after we'd already built the warehouses. Normally you build an elevator, and then you build the warehouses for the extra. But we didn't have time to do it that way, because the big challenge was to build the storage. So we were building storage, but now we stop and think, well, hey, wait a minute, let's just go ahead and build an elevator now. And then a lot of the farmers, that live especially down in that part of the area, they could start bringing their grain to Gladstone. Instead of hauling it back away from the river, they could bring it right there to the river. And so and also what that did, that relieved all of our 6 inland facilities where we were getting grain. It took the pressure off of them. If some of those farmers could leave there and go to the river, that would help them out, because everywhere we were working, we were trying to stay ahead of the curve all through this entire program. We were always trying to get ahead of things. And it's very hard to do, but I think we did a pretty good job of staying ahead of the curve. And this new elevator, that's Craig there and myself and another guy, one of our customers, I think. And we put in large pits all the time. This new elevator we built had, those 2 pits would handle 30,000 bushels per hour. And then we still needed more elevating capacity. So we go into our last warehouse, number 14, and in this one, we didn't put a concrete floor in the entire thing. We left the middle, a big part of it, to where it was just an asphalt floor, to where we could cut it out if we wanted to do something in there, like put a factory in or something. Well, what we ended up doing was putting in another grain dumping pit. So we put a great big pit in here that would do 30,000, which doubled the other 30. Now we have 60,000 bushels. And so then they dump in that pit, and then that's the big yellow thing, is that conveyor that's under the pit is coming right back up from that pit and putting it into trucks. And what they do, we had this thing, there's a guy set in a little tower up there, and the minute one truck was full, he would just flip the thing and start filling the other one. Then another truck could pull in. So we could constantly have trucks going like this and never shut it down. So we would have grain being dumped in the pit constantly, and 2 trucks being loaded, one and then the other, back and forth, taking it out. And the warehouses were just right there to go ahead and unload it into. So that's another system. So then we had moved from 30,000 to 60. Then we used the idea one more time in another building and got our elevating capacity at Gladstone to 75,000 by putting one a little smaller than that last one in another warehouse. And there we had to cut the concrete floor out to do it, of course. But then we went up to a place called Suez in Mercer County. We were trying to use every trick in the book to get our fingers on more grain so we could build more warehouses. And instead of trying to build a warehouse to solve your problem, we were looking for grain so we could build more. So here at Suez, we just dug a hole in the ground and made ourselves a little temporary pit and put us a little portable device under the ground to where the farmers that were bringing into Suez when we first started up there, they would just dump the grain, and we would run with one of those belt conveyors that we loaded trucks with right back into our trucks and headed off to one of our other elevators for the storage. So that was, all these things were designed to grab all what we could and to keep the whole thing working as long as it lasted. There's always setbacks, of course, in any business. And I'm going to show you just a few of those now. One was a roof collapse in 1979, and probably the worst snowstorm we'd had that I can remember of in modern times was in 1979. And we had warehouse roofs collapsed both in Gladstone, in a building there, a warehouse there, and also in Larchland. And of course, the day that people started calling me on the phone to let me know about it, and we had snow drifts almost the top of our sliding glass doors in the family room there, so I could hardly see out, and people were calling and telling me about it. I said, well, there's nothing I can do about it. But anyway, then the next hazard was we had a 250,000 bushel tank in an elevator we had bought at Media just a few years before that collapsed. And once the sides started splitting out of that, we knew we just had to walk away and let it go, because you never knew what instant it was going to explode. So we just had to stay back far enough that you were out of danger and wait for it to happen. So anyway, we lost that big tank there. And then, for instance, this is the flood of 2008, where the levees broke down at Gulfport, and the water turned around and came back north and came up to Gladstone and inundated us. The water had reached almost the eave of this first white building. It got just about to the edge of the roof line. The water was that deep at that point. Now, back in 1993, of course, the levees held. And it was a worse year for flooding than 2008. But see, back in those days, we didn't have any levees breaking our area. This time when the levee broke at Gladstone, of course, even though it was a little lesser flood, but a bad one, the water got us. So that was another thing that was beyond our control. And then, just kind of help the state of Illinois out, they wanted to know if we could put all of our truck fleet, we had about 30 semis that we used to transfer grain from inland to the river and to market. So they made a deal with us that we would haul all the rock in one day to be able to open the highway from Bluffdale into Burlington to get to the bridge. So all that area being inundated in 2008, in one day we hauled all the rock in that day for them to build the road up to where they could reopen Route 34. That was not our hazard, but it was a hazard for all the people who were trying to use US 34. And so I wanted to throw that in as just a little something that of interest. Now, in late 1992, the government forced us to ship or buy our approximately 30 million bushels of corn. At that point in time, we had over 50% of the elevator stored grain in the U.S. They wanted a small reserve scattered throughout the Corn Belt and wanted us to buy a big part of our inventory. But they could not force us to do so, as they were required to ship from those charging the highest rate, and we were the lowest. By offering the industry, of course, the opportunity to store at a lower rate than normal, and the country was full of empty warehouses by other elevators. I know even Monmouth got in on that. We were soon the highest because they put in bids lower. They knew what we charged. Everybody bid lower than we did. And this gave the government plenty of opportunity then to locate corn elsewhere, and they were able to force us to either ship or buy the corn. And you don't want to ship to the government because that could be a headache. We bought the corn with the idea of shipping it in the summer of 1993, when we had all of our other work done. The year that flooding closed the Mississippi River, but that's the year that the Mississippi River was closed then from June until September. So here we are with this 30 million bushel on hand and another harvest coming, and we couldn't turn a wheel. With harvest on top of us, we had to carry the 30 million bushels of corn to the summer of 1994. It was a hairy experience, but through moves on the Board of Trade, we were able to avoid losing money due to owning and storing the grain for another year. We actually made a little bit of money. The market actually developed a large enough carry to a little bit more than cover the cost, to provide us some to cover our costs and deliver a little bit of money to us, a partial payment on storage. So we actually came out of it kind of, you might say, smelling like a rose. So that then made 1994, along with the normal crop, plus all of that, the biggest barge loading year in the history of Twomey Company. Here's my last page, folks. I don't know what time it is, but hey, one of the key importance to the success of Twomey Company was our strong desire to preserve the quality of the corn we were storing. This proved to be beneficial to us, as one of our biggest customers were the Japanese, and they are very conscious of wanting quality products. They trusted the integrity of our corn. We did not have to sample our corn. Everybody had to sample their corn, loading barges. It cost you $200 per barge to get your corn sampled. On a good big day, we could load 5 barges. If we could get out of that, we'd save $1,000 every day by not having to grade the grain. This Japanese firm agreed to take our grades, whatever he said it was good enough for them. It's unheard of in the industry. I don't know, I never heard of it before. But so anyway, quality was a segue to the sale of our company in 2011. We did not have intention to sell our company that you see here, as it was at that time. In fact, in 2009, we had just completed another grain storage facility north of Little York. Which is the next slide. That's the very last one. In 2009, that increased our capacity in 2009 by 10%. Shortly thereafter, we were approached by the same Japanese company we had been in business with for over 15 years. Selling was not an easy decision or one we took lightly. With the growth of the ethanol industry, which we were not involved in, and the ages of our generation, it just seemed the right time to head in that direction. The sale of the company into what is now known as CGB Twomey Group took place in November of 2011. So that kind of ends my story. I want to thank Tim Kramer here today, who's doing all this video work here. You'll see him stand up there by his equipment. Sean Cavanaugh, who got me into this thing in the first place. And then my daughter Susan, who did all of the arranging of these slides. And to Sarah, who did the typing for me. And to Gary Judy, who has done a lot of work on getting this thing ready for today. So I want to thank all those people. I want to thank all of you for coming. And it's like Sean said early on, I'm very thankful in a way to do this because this is my way of leaving a little record behind for our family of about Twomey Company and our family's business and so forth. So I want to thank you, Sean, and hopefully don't call me again next year. Yeah.